it's Sarah here, and in this final lecture of our virtual summit on the rise and fall of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, I'm going to be your guide as we time travel to follow in the forlorn footsteps of a disgraced Cardinal Wolsey as he is escorted under arrest from his archiepiscopal palace at Cawood, or Cawood, some people say, towards London, having been accused and arrested for high treason. As I have just mentioned, we will be virtually resting our head at 3 locations along the way, and we'll be beginning at Cawood, then moving on to Sheffield Manor and ending at Leicester Abbey, where Wolsey came to lay his bones amongst his brethren. Well, as we well know, November 1530 saw the dramatic arrest of Cardinal Wolsey at Cawood in North Yorkshire. It was the first step on a journey that would end in just over 3 weeks later, with the Cardinal's broken body being lowered into its shallow grave at Leicester Abbey. Now, much of the following detail comes from an absolutely fascinating eyewitness account of those final few weeks in Wolsey's life that was written by George Cavendish, who you've heard mentioned earlier in the summit. And he, of course, as we now know, was a gentleman usher in Wolsey's household. And if you're unsure as to what that actually meant in practice, well, it was George's role to keep the door of whichever chamber Wolsey was using at the time. Therefore, he certainly had close and personal access to the Cardinal, and thankfully for us, was privy to the most intimate conversation and events that followed. It's a rare and valuable account, and is one that contains an astonishing amount of detail, allowing the reader to open a portal in time and relive the sorry tale of a once great statesman shattered by the hatred of his enemies. This is the tale of the Cardinal's final journey. And so, as I said, my friends, we are going to start our journey at Cawood, or Cawood Castle in North Yorkshire. A little bit of history first. Cawood Castle is a willowy shadow of the once great archiepiscopal palace that, at its zenith, was described as the, quote, veritable Windsor of the North, unquote. It lay just 7 miles south of the city of York and on a highly navigable bank of the River Ouse. So the most notable feature of Cawood, or Cawood today, is its gatehouse range. According to a local landscape archaeologist from the University of York, Alistair Oswald, who, by the way, has studied Cawood extensively, well, he states that in Henry VIII's time, the palace almost certainly comprised of 2 square courts back to back. And this dual courtyard arrangement was, of course, as we know, typical of the very high status and most fashionable houses of the day. Alistair Oswald goes on to postulate that the building we know today as, in fact, the banqueting house, which is rather confusing since it's actually the gatehouse range that I've referred to above, occupied the front range of the outer court and therefore probably just provided stabling and accommodation. The real dining hall would have occupied the range between the 2 courts. A chapel would have stood on one side of the inner court, and the Archbishop's private accommodation, which he would of course have surrendered to any important royal visitor, would have occupied the rear side of the inner court, or perhaps the eastern side, which looked towards the gardens and the village and the church beyond. Fascinatingly, we know from 2 inventories compiled towards the end of the castle's life that, in all, Cawood Castle comprised of 49 chambers or apartments. 49! That's a big building. Now, with all this information to hand, we're ready to bring some of these chambers to life. as we are drawn back in time to pick up the story of the Cardinal at Cawood. So Wolsey had arrived at Cawood Castle towards the end of September 1529. Now, a little over 1 year later, on the 4th of November 1530, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Walter Walsh, who was a groom of the King's Privy Chamber, arrived at Cawood to arrest the Cardinal. Wolsey was at dinner in his chambers on the first floor at the time. We can assume that it was mid-morning, probably between 10 and 11 a.m, as this was when the Tudors customarily had their main meal of the day. Henry Percy's first task was to secure the castle, commanding the porter of the gate to surrender the keys to the gates, but who would initially, and I quote from George Cavendish, in no wise deliver them to the Earl. In the meantime, Henry Percy also blocked the passage from the principal stairs going up from the Great Hall to Wolsey's privy suite, so that, and again I quote, no man could pass up again that was come down. And in this way, for some time, the Cardinal and certain members of his household remained completely oblivious to the commotion going on in the Great Hall below, until, as Cavendish reports, at last one of my lord's servants chanced to look down into the hall, and returned to my lord, and showed him that my lord of Northumberland was in the said hall. Now it's clear from Wolsey's reaction to hearing of his visitors that the Cardinal was completely clueless of the real and indeed sinister nature of Percy's visit. Remember, Percy had once been a junior member of the Cardinal's household before he had inherited his patrimony. So, the two men knew each other well, with Thomas referring to Henry Percy as his, quote, very old and loving friend. So, rising from his table, Wolsey made to greet his guest, encountering the Earl, in fact, midway up the staircase with, quote, all his men about him, unquote. And their greeting was apparently warm and congenial, with Wolsey taking the Earl by the hand and leading him up to the chamber. But what was this chamber? Well, we know from a seating plan of a medieval event which was held at Cawood in 1465 that the diners were accommodated in one of 5 locations: the Great Hall, the Chief Chamber, the Second Chamber, the Low Hall and the Gallery. Now it's likely that the Great Hall, which we have already encountered on the ground floor, led up to the Chief Chamber, perhaps the Great Watching Chamber, with, in all likelihood, the Second Chamber lying beyond that. And in accordance with what we know of the layout of great Tudor houses of the day, perhaps this was Wolsey's presence chamber. And I suspect that in one of these rooms, the remains of Wolsey's dinner was still laid out on the table. From Cavendish's account, it is clear that Wolsey was keen to show hospitality to his guests and for them to be provided with food and accommodation. The Cardinal, in fact, offered Henry Percy his own bedchamber so that the Earl might change out of his riding attire. Leading the Earl into his nearby bedchamber, Cavendish took up his usual position by the door and was the only one, as he reports, to hear what exactly happened next. Standing at a window by the chimney, the Earl, quote, trembling, said with a very faint and soft voice, "My lord, I arrest you of high treason." Cavendish watched as the two men stood in silence, with Wolsey marvellously astonished. Wolsey demanded to see the commission for his arrest sent by the king. He would bow to no other, as he told the Earl that he feared that an ancient grudge between some of your predecessors and mine might lie behind this abrupt turn of events. Wolsey certainly knew that he had mortal enemies, the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk among them, and of course Anne Boleyn herself. In fact, in this account, is the Cardinal in fact referring to the incident in which he forced Henry Percy to give up his betrothal to Anne Boleyn, who thereafter swore that she would one day bring down the Cardinal if it were in her power to do so? Well, maybe. However, the drama of that morning was not over, my friends, for Cavendish's attention was next caught by the sound of Master Walsh's voice. For while Percy had been busy with Wolsey, Walsh had apparently apprehended the Cardinal's Venetian physician, a certain Dr. Augustine. With the words, "Go in, thou traitor, or I shall make thee," a bewildered and petrified physician was thrust through the doorway with violence. Astonished by these events, Cavendish then watched a more civilised Walsh kneel before the Cardinal. And while he too refused to show Wolsey the commission which gave them the authority to arrest him for treason, the Cardinal nevertheless willingly yielded to this second gentleman. For as a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, Walsh himself was sufficient commission, and Wolsey pledged thereafter to obey the King's will and pleasure, but that he added he had never offended the King's Majesty in word or deed. After all this was done, all haste was made for departure, and while Wolsey's cavalcade did not set off on its winding journey to London until the Sunday, Dr. Augustine was conveyed the very next day with, and I quote, as much speed as they could, his feet tied under the horse's belly. What an indignity. Now on the Sunday morning, Wolsey's household was allowed to come before him in the great chamber, quote, among whom there was not one dry eye, but all pitifully lamented their master's fall and trouble. Wolsey thanked those who had served him diligently, declared his innocence, and shook each by the hand before heading down the stairs and out through the gate hall, I imagine, and then into the inner courtyard beyond, there to mount his mule. Then the great gates of Cawood were swung open to allow the party on its way, and as they were, Wolsey came face to face with around 3,000 well-wishers, who all cried out, God save your grace, God save your grace. The foul evil take all them that have thus taken you from us. We pray God that a very vengeance may light upon them. And so, says Cavendish, the Cardinal was taken on his way. To what fate he knew not, but I imagine he could well guess. But nevertheless, as he did, the crowds ran behind him, and according to Cavendish, they called out that they had loved him so well. Cawood, Thomas Wolsey was taken first to Pontefract, in the 16th century known as Pomfret, where, much to Wolsey's relief, he was lodged at the Abbey. I had feared being taken to Pontefract Castle, which I can tell you, my friends, had a fearsome and blood-soaked reputation as a place to dispose quietly of one's high-status enemies. Think relatives of Elizabeth Woodville. Anyway, that's another story. But from Pontefract, Cavendish records that the cavalcade continued onwards to Doncaster, travelling ever further southwards. Now, clearly careful planning was afoot. Those in charge decided that Wolsey should arrive during the hours of darkness. So many people had taken to following the sorrowful procession, weeping and lamenting, that they wished, they being the authority in charge, wished to avoid more unnecessary scenes of hysteria. And although Wolsey entered the ancient town by torchlight, the plans were thwarted, as the usual crowds amassed with, and I quote, candles in their hands, crying out, "God save your grace, God save your grace, my good Lord Cardinal." The escort and its prisoner were heading for one of the city's religious houses, Blackfriars, where, according to Cavendish, they lodged that night. As far as I can ascertain, sadly, nothing is left of either of the aforementioned abbeys. Now, the following day, the journey continued, and Wolsey was being taken to Sheffield Park, one of the principal residences of the Earl of Shrewsbury. In fact, the Cardinal was to spend the next 18 days at the manor, well housed and honoured, as befitted his status. Well, now later, of course, some of you may well remember that the house would become more famous as one of the places in which Mary, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned during her captivity in England. But for the purposes of today, we will remain clearly focused upon what happened to Thomas Wolsey whilst in residence at the manor. So Wolsey was greeted at the gates of Sheffield Manor on the 8th of November 1530 by George Talbot, the 62-year-old 4th Earl of Shrewsbury, and his second wife Elizabeth. They were accompanied by a train of her gentlewomen and, I quote, all of my lords, gentlemen and yeomen. By that time there was a grand Tudor manor house on site, fashioned from the remodelling and augmentation of an earlier hunting lodge. Now, this phase of work was likely undertaken by the said 4th Earl, probably prior to 1516. The house itself was perched on an elevated promontory of land. It overlooked Sheffield Park, which at around 2,500 acres was one of the largest in the country. This park provided income and fine pastime to the Earl of Shrewsbury, his family and guests. So, at the time of Wolsey's visit, Sheffield Manor was in fact a newly renovated house and one of the two principal residences of the Shrewsbury family in Sheffield, the other now being the entirely lost castle. Fortunately for us, though, a number of accounts and an early plan survive. From these sources, we know that the house was made of brick and timber and that it was arranged around two courtyards, an outer or great court and then an inner one. There were also 2 gardens and 3 yards, all of that covering around 3 acres. Now, the great court itself was almost entirely square and covered 2 acres, and it looked down upon the main west-facing frontage of Sheffield Manor. And from here, the principal access to the inner court was flanked by 2 octagonal red brick towers. This gatehouse itself gave access to a, quote, noble flight of steps which led up to the door that opened into the great gallery. Now, this is important because it is in this gallery that Wolsey would be housed, as we'll hear about more in a moment. Back to the greeting at the gates of Sheffield Manor, where the 2 men welcomed each other courteously and with some affection, Wolsey taking another opportunity to declare his innocence, that his, quote, demeanour and proceedings had always been just and loyal towards his sovereign and liege lord. Shrewsbury certainly tried to comfort Cardinal Wolsey, telling him that he had personally received letters from the king and saying that Wolsey was to be treated not as a prisoner, but as, quote, my good lord and the king's true and faithful subject. Wolsey was no doubt relieved, and the two men walked arm in arm as Shrewsbury escorted the cardinal to his chambers. Now, these chambers are magnificently described in some careful detail in Cavendish's accounts. And from what we know of the lost manor, we can pinpoint exactly where they were. In a, quote, fair chamber at the end of a goodly gallery within a new tower. Now, Shrewsbury had the gallery temporarily partitioned off by a traverse of sarcenet, which is a sort of a soft silk material, and that had been placed across the middle of the chamber. And so, in doing so, Cavendish states, one part was preserved for my lord and the other part for the earl. The scant above ground remains of this once fabulous house and later archaeological excavations allow us to pinpoint the exact position of this gallery. It ran in a north-south direction, fronting onto the Great Court on one side and the inner court on the other. And the tower that is mentioned in Cavendish's account was at the very northern end of the aforementioned gallery, and it was in these rooms that Wolsey was lavishly housed and lacked for nothing. From Cavendish we hear that he enjoyed, quote, goodly and honourable entertainment, unquote, but that the cardinal refused to indulge in earthly pleasures such as hunting, but instead he resorted diligently to prayer. He ate in his own chamber, in accordance with his high status, as might be expected, with meals that included dishes of venison from the park and roasted wardens, which are pears. Now, here things get interesting. For on one evening, while dining in his chamber with a number of the Earl's men and chaplains, Wolsey took ill. Cavendish, who was dressing the wardens at the time, noted how the colour drained from the cardinal's face. Inquiring discreetly about his master's health, Wolsey replied that he was, quote, sudden taken about the stomach with a thing that lieth across my breast as cold as a whetstone. Wolsey diagnosed that it was just wind, but when the symptoms persisted, he asked his gentleman usher to go to the apothecary and inquire if he had anything that would break wind upward. And after some toing and froing going on, in which Cavendish reported on Wolsey's request to the Earl, and the Earl in turn summoned the apothecary with his remedy, Cavendish was finally able to make his way back to the gallery and the cardinal's privy chambers in the tower. Wolsey, it appears, had not moved in the interim. He was clearly in some considerable discomfort. And having tried the white confection in front of his master, presumably to show that it wasn't poison, the cardinal received it wholly altogether at once, and immediately, quote, he broke exceedingly much wind upwards, before heading off to prayer, as he usually did after dinner. Crisis averted for the time being. However, unfortunately for the cardinal, it was not just wind. Cavendish tells us that while at prayer, Wolsey was soon hit by a bout of diarrhoea, which the Tudors called the lask. And while he was at his stool, or toilet, the Earl summoned Cavendish to tell him that Sir William Kingston had arrived with 24 guards to escort the cardinal to London, so that he may try himself and his truth. So while the king had written that he still held the cardinal in high regard and that he should be treated with all honour, both the Earl and Cavendish rightly believed that Wolsey would see this as a dark turn of events. For Sir William Kingston was, of course, Constable of the Tower of London. So it was left to Cavendish to break the difficult news. Wolsey's gentleman usher found him sitting at the upper end of the gallery upon a packing chest of his own, with his beads and staff in his hands. Despite George's protestation that Wolsey had nothing to fear from the king, I suspect that the cardinal had seen too much of the world to be pacified so easily, telling his usher that he could see, quote, more than ye can imagine or do know, unquote. In other words, Wolsey was no fool, nor was he naive. He knew how these things worked. He'd seen it all before. So preparations were made ready for the next day, and the journey towards London would continue, this time under the command of Sir William. However, Wolsey was worn out. The diarrhoea, which had struck him down shortly after dinner, continued right the way through the night, until by the next morning Cavendish reports that the cardinal had had over 50 stools, leaving him very weak, as you might imagine. However, more tellingly, we also hear that the stools were, quote, wondrous black, unquote. That's something that Tudors called choler adustum. Now, that has medical significance, and we will come back to that at the end of our story. But in the meantime, Wolsey knew the symptoms were serious, declaring, quote, if I have not some help shortly, it will cost me my life, unquote. And our physician, who happened to be visiting the Earl, concluded that Wolsey would not live past 4 or 5 days. And greatly weakened, the cardinal therefore stayed one further day at Sheffield Manor, but finally he took up his journey. Thus, from Sheffield Lodge, Wolsey began a weary journey, inexorably travelling southwards towards London. According to Cavendish, the party lodged a night at another of the Earl of Shrewsbury's residences, Hardwicke Hall, known more commonly today as Kirby Hardwicke, and not the more famous Hardwicke Hall associated with the indomitable Bess of Hardwicke. One night was also spent at Nottingham, although Cavendish gives no details of exactly where. We might guess that he stayed at the archiepiscopal residence at Southwell, where he had lodged on his way to Cawood some 18 months earlier. It must have been a painful and exhausting journey for Wolsey. For along the way, Cavendish tells us that his master waxed so sick that he was divers time likely to fall from his mule. However, somehow Wolsey finally made it to Leicester Abbey, arriving there on Saturday the 26th of November. There the abbot and his brethren greeted Wolsey at the abbey gates by the light of many torches. But Wolsey knew the end was fast approaching, declaring famously to the abbot, "Father Abbot, I am come hither to leave my bones amongst you." Now, Leicester Abbey, which was also known as the Abbey of St Mary de Pratis, which means Abbey of the Meadows, was an Augustinian monastery situated just 1 kilometre north of the medieval city of Leicester. It was the largest and one of the most influential Augustinian abbeys in England. The monastery complex occupied about 13 hectares of land. It was home to around 24 canons at the time of Wolsey's visit, And these were not monks, but priests who worked in the local parishes and who lived under the rule of St. Augustine. The black canons, as they were called because of their dark outer garments, were supervised by an abbot, in this case Abbot Pascal. Now, he was notorious for his religious laxity and financial incompetence, and was already under the close scrutiny of powers that be in London. But that's another story, my friends. But back to the abbey, what did it look like? Well, the entire compound was surrounded by a wall, which actually, much of which still survives today. The main abbey church and conventual buildings were sited adjacent to the west bank of the River Soar, which meandered its way through the meadows in which the abbey had been built. Beautiful. The main outer gateway to the abbey compound, which Cavendish mentions in his account, was sited towards the middle of the northern section of the abbey's perimeter wall. It remains the main entrance to the park today, but sadly the gatehouse has long gone. A short track then led southwards to a second inner gatehouse, and beyond that a yard opened up directly outside the main facade of the church and a range of conventual buildings which ran directly southwards from the abbey church, forming the western range of the abbey's cloisters. This range comprised the abbot's lodgings, which were the most splendid and luxurious accommodation in the abbey. And we know from Cavendish's account that they brought him, i.e. Wolsey, on his mule via the directions we've just travelled to the foot of the stairs of his chamber, and there he alighted, and Master Kingston then took him by the arm and led him up the stairs. So we know for sure that Wolsey was housed in a first floor chamber. It's quite possible that the abbot ceded his own lodgings to the cardinal. However, we can't actually be completely sure, for there is another possible contender, and that of course might be the guest lodgings located across a smaller courtyard south of the cloister, although personally I'm in favour of the abbot's lodgings as the place in which Wolsey was housed while at the abbey, and indeed in which he died. Having been escorted to his chambers, Wolsey went straight to bed, and according to his gentleman usher grew, quote, sicker and sicker. By the Monday morning, Cavendish felt that his master was drawing fast to his end. He describes standing by Wolsey's bedside, with the shutters closed, the wax tapers burning, casting a willowy light around the room. Wolsey roused from a semi-conscious state, asking who was there and what was the time. He was clearly confused. When Cavendish replied that it was 8 o'clock, the cardinal became distressed, saying, 8 o'clock? That cannot be. It cannot be 8 o'clock, for by 8 o'clock ye shall lose your master. For my time draweth near, and I must depart out of this world. That was quite a premonition. Anyway, after dinner, which of course, as I said earlier, in Tudor times was served around the middle of the day, Master Kingston called Cavendish to his chamber. Back at Cawood, the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, had stayed behind to dismantle the cardinal's household. And having found evidence that Wolsey had sequestered £1,000 somewhere, which was, of course, a massive amount of money at the time, the king, naturally, had been informed. And he, in turn, had commanded Kingston to question the cardinal and find out where the money was stashed. Cavendish warned the constable of the Tower to make haste in his questioning, for he feared the cardinal would not live past tomorrow in the morning. Kingston duly went to the cardinal's bedside. What followed was a strange conversation between the two men. Kingston demanded to know where the money had come from and where it could be found. The cardinal listed the names of those he had borrowed money from, but declared in the end that, quote, while he would not conceal it from the king, unquote, and that he would gladly, quote, declare it, unquote, Master Kingston should have a little patience with him. Despite the cardinal being in extremis, Kingston settled for Wolsey's promise that he would reveal where the money was to be found the following morning. Through that night, Wolsey waxed very sick and often swooned. At 4 o'clock in the morning, once again he roused from his semi-conscious state and asked for a little meat, verbally boxing Cavendish's ears for not having prepared any at hand. Of course, Cavendish immediately called up the cook, then Wolsey's chaplain, Master Palms, and finally he went to William Kingston. He warned the latter that "my lord will not live," and that Kingston should make haste to the cardinal's bedside, for he was in great danger. Kingston was not impressed, chastising Cavendish for making the cardinal believe that he was sicker than he actually was. Oh, poor guy. Nevertheless, despite his misgivings, Kingston returned once more to the cardinal's chambers. And what follows is an extraordinary speech by Henry's erstwhile First Minister. Firstly, he said, he knew he was dying. He declared that having had a fever and flux, diarrhoea, for 8 days, the outcome could only be, quote, excoriation of the entrails or frenzy, or else imminent death. Wolsey, it seemed, preferred the latter. It was the best remedy of the three. Then Wolsey made his now famous declaration that if he had served God as diligently as he had done the king, he would not have given him over in his grey hairs. The cardinal reasserted that he had served the king faithfully, even in the weighty matter yet depending, which of course meant the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He recalled how many times he had knelt before Henry VIII in his privy chamber, the space of an hour or two, begging him to change his mind on a matter, and had yet failed. Thus he gives a sober warning to Kingston: to be well advised and assured what matter ye put in his head, for ye shall never pull it out again. Finally, after tirade about a necessity to defend against the spread of Lutheran heretics in the realm, Wolsey's speech began to falter, and his, quote, eyes were set in his head as his sight failed him. The cardinal's body was shutting down. Abbot Pascal delivered extreme unction according to Catholic rites, and as the clock struck 8 in the morning, as the cardinal had predicted, he gave up the ghost. Thomas Wolsey was dead. But I simply cannot end this tale without putting my pennyworth in regarding just what did kill Cardinal Wolsey, because there's still quite a lot of controversy. Well, Cavendish states very clearly that Wolsey's symptoms were a combination of upper gastrointestinal wind followed by profuse diarrhoea, which was, as I said before, wondrous black. Now, some of you may not know that I trained as a medic and admitted many such patients to hospital who were experiencing similar symptoms. And for me, it's the black diarrhoea that clinches the deal. Although it would have been even better if Cavendish had recounted the foul stench which invariably accompanies this symptom. As far as I'm concerned, we can be in no doubt that Wolsey's cause of death came from prolonged bleeding from his upper gastrointestinal tract, i.e. his stomach or duodenum. And this was most likely from a ruptured peptic ulcer or a tear in the lining of the stomach. Nature, in fact, probably saved the cardinal from a brutal end delivered by the executioner's axe. But what happened after Wolsey's death? Because the story is not quite complete. Well, as you might imagine, a messenger was dispatched to London to tell the king of the passing of the Cardinal of York. At the same time, the mayor of Leicester and his brethren were sent for so they could witness the corpse. Clearly, Kingston, rather wisely, did not want to find himself on the wrong end of an accusation that he had spirited the cardinal away to safety. When Wolsey's body was removed from its bed, and it was undressed, a hair shirt was found underneath his smock of the finest linen Holland cloth, a thing known only to his chaplain, according to Cavendish. There is no record of the body's entrails being removed, nor of it being embalmed, as was often the case with high-status aristocrats. Instead, Wolsey was lain in a coffin of boards, wearing not only his hair shirt, but all the vestures and ornaments that he had professed in when he was consecrated bishop and archbishop, such as his mitre, crozier, ring and pall. Wolsey lay in his coffin, presumably in his chamber, until 4 or 5 of the clock at night, so that, quote, all men might see him dead there without feigning, unquote. Whereafter he was conveyed to the church with many torches alight, with his corpse being set in Our Lady Chapel, which was to the north of the chancel in the Abbey church. Wax tapers were placed around the coffin, which burned throughout the night while the canons sang a dirge. Then at 4 o'clock in the morning, Mass was said, and afterwards the Cardinal's body was finally committed to the ground. But here's the thing, where is the Cardinal's body? The answer is, my friends, that no one knows. Frustratingly, there have been several attempts to locate Wolsey's lost tomb in both the 19th and the 20th centuries, when extensive digs were carried out on site. But despite Cavendish's clear account of the Cardinal being buried in the Lady Chapel, the exact location of his tomb remains a mystery. No one has been yet able to find his body. But what a discovery that would make. One of the most powerful men in Tudor England dressed in full religious regalia. Well, following the discovery of Richard III, who of course was buried in Grey Friars in the medieval city of Leicester, there have been renewed calls to try and find the final resting place of Thomas Wolsey, the man who Cavendish recalls was, quote, once the haughtiest man in all his proceedings that then lived, unquote. But until then, Wolsey remains elusively out of our grasp, just as he eluded Henry's justice nearly 500 years ago. And in the meantime, I'm left wondering if Henry ever did get his hands on that £1,000. Well, my friends, that concludes our journey in time and indeed this autumn's virtual summit. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed listening to the lectures and the interviews as much as we had fun putting them together for you. Of course, as ever, I'd love to hear your feedback, so if you want to write to me, do so please at sarah@thetudortravelguide.com and share your thoughts or even your suggestions for future summits. Now, on the point of how to access these videos in the future, well, as I have said in the various emails that you've already received, these lectures will remain accessible to anyone who has registered for this summit until after the festive period, so that's the 5th of January to be precise. So there's plenty of time to catch up between your Christmas celebrations. It's just perfect if you want some you time and a dose of Tudor history over the Christmas period. After that, these videos will be made freely available only to those people who subscribe to my YouTube channel as an advanced YouTube member. This is a subscription at a rate of £4.99 a month. And while a member, you can not only access these videos, but all my videos from earlier and future summits to come at any time, plus some of my other most in-depth content. Now this brings me to talk about my virtual tour of Tudor London, which was launched just last month. It's a series of 6 videos which were conceived and created at the beginning of March's lockdown here in the UK as an escape for those of us who wanted to time travel but who, for COVID reasons, illness or otherwise, had just not been able to. So the creative team here at the Tudor Travel Guide have used green screen technology to take you on a time travelling adventure where all you need is your imagination and a sense of fun as we help you recreate the splendour of various prominent Tudor buildings in London as they would have been during the Tudor period. Now the first video to go live was Greenwich Palace, and as I said, that was premiered last month via Lady Catherine's Renaissance Fair. Now it now remains available for anyone to see, and I will include the link in the text below. I can now though announce that the launch of the second video spotlighting the royal apartments at the Tower of London has already gone live on my advanced YouTube channel membership, with the remaining 4 in the series being released every month between now and March. So if you want to support my work and have access to my best video content for as long as the life of my YouTube channel, then do follow the link above or in the description below to find out what is on offer and how to sign up to subscribe to my channel membership. Remember, access to these summit videos and the virtual tour series is only available at the advanced level. Okay, moving on. Well, tomorrow I will be selecting the winner of this summit's giveaway, and I will be emailing everyone with the name of the lucky winner of our book bundle for this summit. So with that, all that remains for me now is to thank all of those speakers who so generously contributed to this event, and to thank each of you. Thank you most heartily, my friends, for accompanying me during this summit. It has, as ever, been a delight. So, until our next adventure, there is, of course, only one thing left for me to say, and that is, of course, happy time travelling.